I was sitting at my desk when Clarissa Monroe burst through the door, her face flushed, voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Why is the roadmap completely unusable?" she demanded. "The executive board meeting is in 2 hours and nothing makes sense." I looked up from my screen, keeping my expression neutral. I wasn't involved in creating it. "Don't give me that," she snapped. "You're the senior product architect. This is your responsibility." Her hand moved toward my desk drawer, the locked one where I kept my documentation. I noticed the slight hesitation, the way her eyes darted to it before returning to my face. She was looking for something, anything she could use to shift the blame completely onto me. 4 days earlier, she'd told me quite differently. Clarissa had joined Radiance Technologies 8 months before as Director of Product Strategy. She arrived with an impressive resume from a Silicon Valley unicorn and immediately began reshaping our division's approach. In her first all-hands meeting, she spoke about aggressive innovation and moving fast without legacy thinking. She used phrases like disruptive paradigms and exponential growth trajectories that sounded impressive but meant little when examined closely. I'd been at Radiance for 6 years, building our product architecture from scattered components into a coherent ecosystem. My work wasn't flashy, but it was thorough. Every feature connected properly. Every dependency was documented. Every technical decision had a rationale that could withstand scrutiny. When the authentication system needed upgrading, I'd spent 4 months ensuring backward compatibility so existing customers wouldn't experience disruptions. When we integrated the payment processing module, I'd built in redundancy layers that prevented a single point of failure. Clarissa saw things differently. In our first one-on-one, she told me I was too cautious and overly focused on technical details instead of business impact. "Markets move quickly, Mira," she said, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "We need people who can think strategically, not just execute. Your technical skills are solid, but leadership requires vision." The implication was clear: I was a technician, not a strategist. Never mind that I designed the architecture supporting 3 of our most successful product lines. Never mind that my technical decisions had prevented at least a dozen potential crises over the years. I nodded and continued doing what I'd always done, ensuring our products actually worked. The problems started small. I'd send technical assessments of proposed features, and Clarissa would schedule meetings without me to discuss them. She'd reassign my project reviews to newer team members, then critique the incomplete analysis they provided. In stand-ups, she'd interrupt my updates to redirect the conversation toward higher-level thinking. The first major incident happened in month 3. We were evaluating a potential partnership with a data analytics provider. I'd reviewed their API documentation and found significant security vulnerabilities. Their authentication protocol was outdated, and their data encryption standards didn't meet our compliance requirements. I wrote a detailed memo explaining the risks and recommending we either require them to upgrade their security or look for alternative partners. Clarissa's response came via email: "Let's not get bogged down in technical weeds. The business case is clear. Their analytics capabilities would give us a significant competitive advantage." I replied, copying the VP of Engineering: "I understand the business value, but we have contractual obligations to protect customer data. Their current security standards create liability exposure that could cost us existing contracts." She didn't respond to that email. Instead, she scheduled a meeting with the VP, without me, and apparently convinced him that my concerns were overblown and that I was resistant to partnership opportunities. The partnership moved forward. 2 months later, our compliance team discovered the same security issues during their audit and required extensive remediation work. The analytics provider had to rebuild significant portions of their API, delaying the integration by 4 months and costing us the competitive advantage Clarissa had promised. During the post-mortem meeting, Clarissa framed it as a learning opportunity. "This shows why we need more robust initial vetting," she said, as though the problem had been insufficient analysis rather than ignored analysis. I had the original email exchange. I saved it in a folder I'd started keeping, a simple directory structure on my local drive, documentation/2024/project_concerns. Each subfolder contained emails, meeting notes, and technical memos organized by date and topic. By month 5, the pattern was obvious. Clarissa would present my work to senior leadership without crediting me, or she'd modify my recommendations and claim the changes were corrections of my overly conservative approach. In meetings, she'd reference conversations we'd never had, telling others I'd agreed to things I'd explicitly opposed. One particularly egregious example, I'd proposed a phased rollout approach for our new user interface, with beta testing in 3 markets before full deployment. This would let us identify usability issues before they affected our entire customer base. Clarissa presented the plan to the executive team but changed it to an immediate full deployment, claiming I'd endorsed the approach after initial concerns. When the rollout caused a spike in customer support calls, exactly the scenario I'd warned about, she told the leadership team that I'd underestimated the change management requirements and that we'd need to invest more in user training. She never mentioned that the phased approach would have caught these issues early with minimal customer impact. I started documenting everything. Not dramatically, just methodically. I kept copies of emails, meeting notes, and Slack messages. I recorded timestamps of when I submitted reports versus when decisions were made. I noted who attended which meetings and what was discussed. I created a simple spreadsheet tracking my recommendations, Clarissa's responses, and eventual outcomes. The pattern became stark when viewed in aggregate. Of the 14 technical concerns I'd raised over 5 months, 12 had been dismissed or ignored. Of those 12, 8 had resulted in problems ranging from minor delays to significant customer impact. My success rate for identifying risks was over 90%, yet my input was being systematically excluded. The exclusion tactics became more sophisticated. Clarissa started scheduling critical meetings during times she knew I had conflicts. She'd send meeting invitations for 3 p.m. on days when I had standing commitments with the infrastructure team, then claim I'd chosen not to attend. When I pointed out the conflicts, she'd respond that priorities sometimes require flexibility and suggest I delegate my other responsibilities. She also began creating parallel communication channels. Instead of using our standard project management system where all decisions were documented, she'd have conversations in private Slack channels or hallway discussions, then present the outcomes as established consensus. When I'd ask about the decision-making process, she'd say things like, "We discussed this extensively last week," or "The team aligned on this approach already." The gaslighting was subtle but persistent. She'd reference emails she'd never sent, conversations that never happened, and agreements I'd never made. Early on, I'd question these discrepancies. "I don't recall that conversation," I'd say, or "I don't see that email in my inbox." Her response was always the same, a slight smile, a patient tone. "I'm sure you're just overwhelmed with everything on your plate, Mira. It's easy to lose track of details when you're stretched thin." The implication was that I was disorganized, forgetful, unreliable. Other people in meetings would hear these exchanges and draw their own conclusions. After all, Clarissa was confident and specific, while I was expressing uncertainty. That's when I started being even more meticulous. I began taking screenshots of important Slack conversations. I recorded meeting attendance using calendar exports. I kept a daily log of significant interactions, just brief notes. 10:30 a.m. Clarissa asked about database migration timeline. Told her 3 weeks minimum. She frowned and said, "We need to move faster." Nothing dramatic. Just facts, timestamps, and direct quotes when possible. The planning session incident happened in early October. Our Q1 roadmap was due, and I'd spent 3 weeks preparing materials, market analysis, technical feasibility assessments, resource allocation models, and dependency maps. I'd coordinated with engineering leads across 4 teams to ensure the timeline was realistic. The market analysis alone had taken 5 days. I'd reviewed competitor product releases, analyzed feature adoption rates in our existing customer base, and identified emerging technical standards we needed to support. I'd created a scoring matrix that weighted customer demand against implementation complexity and strategic alignment. For the technical feasibility assessment, I'd worked with the infrastructure team to map out our current capacity constraints. Our continuous integration pipeline could handle approximately 40 deployments per quarter without degrading performance. Our database cluster had sufficient capacity for the projected user growth, but only if we completed a planned migration to distributed architecture. Our front-end framework was due for a major version upgrade, which would affect any new UI components we built. All of this context mattered. You can't create a realistic roadmap without understanding the technical foundation you're building on. I'd also spent considerable time on the dependency mapping. Our products weren't isolated, they shared authentication systems, data pipelines, and infrastructure components. A change to one product could impact others. I documented these connections in a detailed diagram showing which features required which underlying capabilities and how different project timelines intersected. The resource allocation model was perhaps the most critical piece. I'd worked with engineering managers to understand their team capacities, accounting for planned vacation time, ongoing maintenance work, and technical debt obligations. You can't just assign features to teams and expect them to materialize. You need to understand what those teams are already committed to. Clarissa called me into her office 2 days before the session. I'd been thinking about the planning approach, she began, closing her laptop with a decisive click. We need fresh perspectives. People who can think beyond incremental improvements. I've incorporated several transformational initiatives in the draft, I said. The AI-assisted search feature and the multi-platform synchronization system are both significant leaps forward. She waved dismissively. It's not about the content, Neera. It's about the mindset. I'm bringing in Callum Reed to lead the session. He's only been here 4 months, but he has the kind of forward-thinking energy we need. Callum was a product manager I'd hired myself. Bright, enthusiastic, genuinely talented, and almost completely unfamiliar with our technical architecture. He'd come from a consumer apps background where development cycles were measured in weeks, not quarters, and where you could iterate quickly without worrying about enterprise customer commitments or compliance requirements. Callum doesn't have context on our infrastructure constraints, I said carefully. The roadmap needs to account for the database migration, the framework upgrade, and the capacity limitations in our deployment pipeline. Without that context. This is exactly what I mean, Clarissa interrupted, leaning forward with an intensity that felt rehearsed. You immediately jump to limitations instead of possibilities. Callum sees opportunities. He's not weighed down by legacy concerns. He asks, what could we achieve, instead of what might go wrong? Risk assessment isn't pessimism, I said. It's realism. We have contractual obligations to enterprise customers who rely on our uptime guarantees. We can't. Neera. She held up a hand. I've made my decision. Callum will lead the planning session. You're welcome to attend as a participant, but I need him to drive the creative direction without being constrained by technical objections at every turn. The dismissal was clear, but I tried once more. My role is senior product architect. Strategic planning is explicitly part of my job description. And you'll still be involved in execution, she said smoothly. But for this initial ideation phase, I want unfettered creativity. Once we have the vision established, you can work on making it technically feasible. That's not how it works. You can't separate vision from feasibility and expect good outcomes. Strategy disconnected from execution isn't bold, it's fantasy. But I nodded once. Understood. Good, she said, already turning back to her screen. I'm confident he'll deliver something truly innovative. I walked back to my desk, opened my documentation folder, and created a new subfolder labeled Q1_planning_exclusion. I saved the meeting notes, the email confirmation of the decision that arrived 30 minutes later, and my complete draft roadmap with timestamps showing 3 weeks of preparation and coordination with 4 engineering teams. Then I did something else. I sent Callum an email offering to be available if he had any questions during the planning process. I kept it professional and supportive. I know Clarissa asked you to lead the Q1 planning session. I've been working on technical feasibility analysis that might be useful context. Happy to answer any questions about infrastructure constraints or dependency requirements. He never responded. I suspect Clarissa told him not to engage with me, framing it as protecting his creative process from my negative influence. The planning session happened without me. I learned from colleagues that it was chaotic. Callum presented ambitious ideas, multi-product integrations, aggressive timelines, resource allocations that assumed unlimited engineering capacity. Clarissa championed every proposal, praising his visionary thinking. One engineer who attended told me about it over coffee. It was like watching someone design a skyscraper without considering whether the ground could support it, he said. Callum suggested we launch the AI search feature in February. When I mentioned that the machine learning infrastructure wouldn't be ready until March at the earliest, Clarissa said we should challenge our assumptions about what's possible. Did anyone push back? I asked. A few people tried, he said. But Clarissa kept redirecting. She'd say things like, let's capture the idea first and work out the details later, or I don't want technical concerns to kill momentum. By the end, people just stopped objecting. That's how bad roadmaps get created. Not through malice, but through a combination of inexperience and a culture that treats technical reality as negotiable. No one asked about technical dependencies. No one validated the assumptions. No one checked whether the timelines were achievable given our actual capacity and constraints. 2 days later, Clarissa's assistant sent out the draft roadmap. I opened it at my desk, already knowing what I'd find. It was a disaster. Feature releases scheduled without accounting for prerequisite infrastructure work. Integration timelines that assumed components would be ready before their actual planned completion dates. Resource allocations that double-booked key engineers. The dependency map was essentially decorative, it showed connections that didn't reflect actual technical requirements. Specific examples of the failures: the AI search feature was scheduled for February launch, but it required the machine learning infrastructure that wouldn't be deployed until March. The multi-platform synchronization system was planned for January, but it depended on the database migration that was scheduled for completion in February, and database migrations always encounter delays. 3 different features were assigned to the same senior engineer during the same 2-week period. The mobile app redesign was scheduled without accounting for the framework upgrade that would require rewriting significant portions of the existing codebase. I created a detailed analysis of every flaw. 17 critical errors where the roadmap was literally impossible to execute as written. 32 moderate risks where success depended on everything going perfectly with no delays or complications. Dozens of minor inconsistencies in naming, versioning, and dependencies. I spent 6 hours on that analysis, creating a comprehensive document that explained not just what was wrong, but why it was wrong and what the consequences would be. I included references to our actual infrastructure capacity, current team commitments, and technical dependencies. I provided alternative timelines that would actually be achievable. I saved it in my documentation folder but didn't send it to anyone. I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted to see if Clarissa's approach of ignoring technical reality would finally produce consequences visible enough that leadership would notice. I'd been documenting problems for months, but they'd all been things that could be papered over or blamed on execution rather than planning. This was different. This would fail spectacularly and publicly. So I waited. For days after the planning session, Clarissa stormed into my workspace. Why is the roadmap completely unusable? She demanded again, her voice carrying across the open office. Several colleagues looked up from their desks. I saw them exchange glances, everyone could sense the tension. I met her gaze steadily. You removed me from the planning process. I wasn't involved in creating it. But you've seen it, she pressed. You must have noticed the problems. I saw it when it was distributed 2 days ago. And you said nothing? Her voice rose higher. You just let this go to the executive board? You told me Callum was leading the effort because he was more forward-thinking, I replied calmly. I assumed you were confident in his work. Her jaw tightened. I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She'd backed herself into a corner. If she admitted the roadmap was flawed, she'd have to explain why she'd excluded the senior product architect from strategic planning. If she tried to defend it, she'd be presenting an obviously unworkable plan to the executive board. I need you to fix this. Now. The board meeting is in 2 hours, I said. A proper roadmap requires weeks of analysis and coordination. I can't reconstruct that in 2 hours. Then give me something, she hissed, leaning closer. Anything I can present that makes sense. I reached into my drawer, the one she'd been staring at with desperate intensity, and pulled out my original 3-week draft. The one I'd prepared before she'd excluded me. I'd printed a clean copy the previous evening, anticipating this exact moment. This was the version I prepared before you reassigned the work. She grabbed it, flipping through pages frantically. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion to something darker as she realized what she was holding. A complete, professional roadmap with detailed feasibility analysis, realistic timelines, and proper dependency mapping. Everything Callum's version lacked. Why didn't you share this before? You told me you wanted fresh perspectives from people not weighed down by legacy concerns, I said. I took you at your word. She stared at me for a long moment. I could see her trying to determine if I was being sincere or deliberately sabotaging her. The truth was somewhere in between. I had stepped back as directed, but I'd also anticipated that her approach would fail and positioned myself accordingly. She turned and walked away without another word, clutching my roadmap like a life preserver. The board meeting apparently went poorly. Clarissa presented my original roadmap, but executives had already reviewed Callum's version. They wanted to know why there were two completely different plans and why the first one had been unusable. I heard about it from Trevor Ashworth, the VP of Engineering, who'd been in the room. He stopped by my desk that afternoon. That was quite a presentation, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Clarissa spent most of her time explaining why the first roadmap didn't account for technical constraints. Did she mention who created which version? She tried to avoid specifics, he said. She talked about collaborative processes and iterative refinement. But Maureen asked directly who had done the technical feasibility analysis in the version she was presenting. Maureen Zhang was our chief technology officer, brilliant, direct, and intolerant of organizational nonsense. What did Clarissa say? She said you provided input on technical constraints, Trevor replied. Maureen asked to see the original version, the one that had gone out to the board earlier. When she saw the difference, she asked how a roadmap without basic dependency analysis had made it to the executive level. That must have been uncomfortable. It was enlightening, Trevor said. Maureen asked if you'd been involved in the original planning session. Clarissa said she'd wanted to encourage blue sky thinking without technical limitations. Maureen pointed out that technical limitations aren't optional, they're the difference between a plan and a fantasy. According to Trevor, Clarissa had tried to explain that there had been a communication breakdown and that she'd caught the errors in time. One board member asked directly who had created the flawed version. She deflected, saying it was a collaborative process. That's when things escalated beyond her control. Maureen sent out a meeting request that afternoon. Subject: Q1 Planning Process Review. Attendees: me, Clarissa, Callum, Trevor, and Denise Park, the head of product operations. I knew what was coming. This wasn't a discussion, it was an investigation. The meeting happened the next morning in a windowless conference room on the executive floor. Maureen opened her laptop and projected a split-screen comparison of the two roadmaps. I need to understand how we ended up with two drastically different plans, she said, her tone professional but firm. Neera, can you walk us through your version? I did, concisely. I explained the analysis methodology, the coordination with engineering teams, the dependency validation, and the timeline calculations. I noted that I'd submitted it 3 weeks before the board presentation and that it had been reviewed by 4 engineering leads who'd validated the technical feasibility. And Callum, Maureen continued, can you explain your approach? Callum looked uncomfortable, his usual enthusiasm completely absent. Clarissa asked me to lead a planning session focused on ambitious growth targets. We brainstormed features that would have high market impact. Did you validate technical feasibility? I assumed the engineering teams would flag any issues. Were engineering leads in the session? No, it was just product and strategy people. Clarissa said she wanted to establish the vision first without getting bogged down in implementation details. Maureen's expression didn't change, but I saw her make a note on her laptop. She turned to Clarissa. Why wasn't Neera involved in the planning session? She's the senior product architect. Strategic planning is explicitly part of her role. Clarissa straightened in her chair, attempting to project the confidence that usually served her well. I wanted to encourage innovative thinking without being constrained by existing technical limitations. Neera is excellent at execution, but I needed someone who could think more expansively about product possibilities. Technical limitations aren't optional, Maureen said quietly. They're reality. Neera, why didn't you raise concerns when you saw Callum's roadmap? I wasn't asked for input, I replied. Clarissa had explicitly told me she wanted fresh perspectives and that I was too focused on legacy concerns. I interpreted that as a directive to step back from the planning process. Did you have concerns about the roadmap? Yes. Documented? I opened my laptop and shared my screen, showing the analysis I'd prepared. 17 critical errors, each one explained with technical details and projected impact. The scheduled AI search feature that required infrastructure not yet deployed. The synchronization system that depended on an incomplete database migration. The resource allocations that triple-booked key engineers. The room went silent as people read through the list. Clarissa spoke up. This is exactly the kind of negative thinking I was trying to avoid in the planning process. Every organization has constraints, but successful companies find ways to overcome them rather than being limited by them. Maureen turned to her. These aren't artificial constraints, Clarissa. You can't launch a feature that requires infrastructure you haven't built yet. That's not pessimism, it's chronology. We could have accelerated the infrastructure deployment, Clarissa insisted. Trevor interjected. We couldn't. The machine learning infrastructure depends on the cloud migration that's currently in progress. Unless you're suggesting we pause the migration, which would disrupt our entire production environment. Maureen closed her laptop. I'm expanding this review. I want a full audit of planning processes, decision-making, and communication patterns over the past 6 months. Neera, I'll need you to provide all relevant documentation. Clarissa, you'll be meeting with HR tomorrow to discuss interim arrangements while the review is conducted. The meeting ended. As we filed out, Callum approached me in the hallway. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have asked for your input. I knew the timelines felt aggressive, but Clarissa kept saying we needed to think bigger. You're not the problem here, I told him. You were asked to do something you didn't have the context for. That's a failure of process and leadership, not of your abilities. He nodded, still looking miserable. I felt bad for him. He'd been set up to fail by Clarissa's approach, just like I'd been set up to look obstructionist for pointing out reality. The investigation took 3 weeks. I provided everything I'd collected, emails showing my warnings that were ignored, meeting notes documenting decisions made without technical input, Slack messages where Clarissa had misrepresented my positions, and timestamped records of when I'd submitted analyses versus when they were actually reviewed. I also provided the spreadsheet I'd been maintaining, the one tracking my recommendations, responses, and outcomes. 14 technical concerns raised, 12 dismissed, 8 resulting in problems. The pattern was undeniable. But the investigation went beyond my documentation. Other people came forward too. Engineers who'd been overruled on technical assessments shared their stories. One had warned that our API rate limiting was insufficient for projected growth and been told not to create artificial bottlenecks. 2 months later, we'd had a service degradation incident when traffic exceeded capacity. Another had flagged security vulnerabilities in a third-party integration and been told the partnership was too strategically important to delay over minor technical details. That integration was now being rebuilt because our compliance team had found the same issues. Product managers who'd been pressured to inflate estimates came forward. One described being asked to change a 6-month timeline to 3 months in a presentation to senior leadership, with Clarissa saying we need to show we can move fast. When the project actually took 7 months, Clarissa had blamed scope creep and execution failures rather than acknowledging the initial timeline had been unrealistic. Team members who'd watched their work get repackaged and presented by Clarissa without credit-shared documentation. Presentation decks where their analysis had been copied verbatim but credited to the strategy team. Emails where Clarissa had asked for their input on a proposal, then presented that proposal as her own idea in meetings they weren't invited to. The HR team interviewed 15 people. They reviewed hundreds of emails and Slack messages. They examined meeting calendars to verify attendance patterns. They compared project outcomes to initial technical assessments. The patterns were undeniable. Clarissa had systematically marginalized anyone who raised concerns, centralized decision-making around herself, and prioritized appearance over substance. She'd created an environment where disagreement was treated as disloyalty and technical expertise was seen as an obstacle rather than an asset. The roadmap failure wasn't an isolated incident, it was the inevitable result of months of dysfunctional leadership. You can't ignore reality indefinitely. Eventually, it catches up. The findings were delivered to senior leadership behind closed doors. I wasn't in the room, but Maureen briefed me afterward. The investigation confirmed serious issues with planning and team management, she said. We'll be making structural changes. But understand, this wasn't you versus Clarissa. It was a system failure, and leadership didn't do its job. She was right. I shouldn't have needed a documentation folder. In a healthy organization, raising concerns wouldn't require building a defensive archive. What happens now? I asked. Clarissa will be leaving Radiance. And we're re-evaluating how we assess leadership and what behavior we've been excusing in the name of results. 2 days later, Clarissa held a team meeting. She looked diminished, her confidence forced. She delivered a polished statement about communication breakdowns and new review procedures, the kind of HR-approved language meant to frame the situation as process improvement, not leadership failure. She didn't acknowledge the investigation or the people she'd sidelined. But the organization already knew. Conversations were happening quietly across the company, and her authority had drained away. She lasted 2 more weeks. 3 weeks after the investigation ended, Maureen announced the formal changes. Effective immediately, Clarissa Monroe will be transitioning out, she said, diplomatic but unmistakable. Then, we're creating a chief product architect role to ensure technical feasibility is part of strategy from the start. Neera Rivers will assume this position. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. I nodded, steady. This wasn't a victory lap, it was responsibility. Afterward, people came forward with their own stories, ignored safety concerns, lost opportunities, credit taken, trust eroded. Some had been collecting their own evidence. It matters, I told one. Documentation always matters. Only then did I understand the full scope of the damage. Clarissa hadn't just made bad decisions, she'd created an environment where people protected themselves instead of doing their best work.